Hello and welcome back to Release Radar. I'm Chris Biscardi, and today we're going to talk about Nushell 0.30. Nushell is a replacement for Bash, Zish, Fish, or whatever other shell that you happen to be using. I've been using it exclusively for about a week now on top of the Alacrity terminal emulator, and the quickest elevator pitch I can give for Nushell is the output of ls. Now, if you're used to seeing ls output, you're used to seeing this, which is just a bunch of strings. ls in Nushell gives you structured output, which means that what we've seen on the terminal right here is actually a table that we can interact with. And this is the main advantage of using Nushell for your terminal environment. For example, to get the table we just saw, we type ls. If we want to sort it by the size, we can just tell it to sort by size. One thing I'd really like to point out here is that the size by default is biggest on the bottom, and that actually is something that's really useful if your terminal isn't quite tall enough to contain all of the output. Now, if we compare this to what we would have to do this in the normal bash environment, we have to start diving into flags pretty quickly. In this case, you can see that ls from Nushell doesn't actually take the L, H, capital S, or R flags. So we need to call out to, the regular bash ls. We can do that by putting a caret in front of ls. Now, if I widen this terminal a little bit, we can see that all of the files are listed according to how big they are, in the same order that we just saw, etc., etc. But to do this, we had to know about 4 different flags. This one gives us all of the extra output, including the size information, the permissions, and other things. H gives us human readable output, which makes it so that we see 64 bytes here or 61 megabytes here. Capital S will sort by that size, and R will make it so that the biggest size is on the bottom, just like what we got out of Nushell. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that this is pretty readable for anybody that's not already familiar with bash idioms. And I really like the way that this ls pipe to sort by size lets us select one of the columns to sort by. And that brings us to the biggest change in the 0.30 release, major engine changes that lead to a simplicity of the core code, as well as bigger improvements to performance. We'll skip the install step, and you can check that out if you're interested in Nushell later. The performance improvements from the benchmarks that they've put out between the 0.29 and 0.30 release seem pretty drastic. In this chart, lower is better. So red, the 0.30 release, versus blue, the 0.29 release. These charts are created from a couple of different scripts. So one is a script that creates a gradient, which is the bar chart on the left, and one is this echo script. So all I'm going to do is take this and drop it into a file. You can see that I'm echoing the string that is the command, and then piping it to save mytest.new, which is the same thing that you would have if you were writing a shell script. Now we can see that mytest.new is around, and it's just the same command that we see in this blog post. To run this ourselves, we can do time new mytest.new, which times Nushell running the mytest.new script. Now, I've run this before and it'll take about 20 seconds, so I'll just speed it up. That took about 22 seconds on my machine. I didn't run this on 0.29, so I have nothing to compare to, but considering this is a Mac Pro from 2013, I think that's pretty decent. After performance, they talk about this new built-in variable called scope, which I'm actually not going to talk about right now. We're going to move on to the new commands. Looking at the first command is math square root, and math square root does what it says on the tin. So if we pick a big number, we pipe it to math square root, we'll get whatever the square root is. Any and all we'll talk about in a second after we talk about these path changes. So if we type pwd, which is also known as present working directory, pwd, we'll get the current working directory. In this case, it's users Chris, GitHub, Christopher Biscardi, christopherbiscardi.github.com, which is quite a mouthful. If we check out present working directory and we pipe that output into path.parse, we get a table with the parent, stem, and extension columns. So it's considering the .com to be the extension, the Christopher Biscardi to be the stem, and then we can get the parent. This is the same for path.split, except it gives us a list. Going back to why use Nushell at all, if we can turn present working directory into a table, then we can also get the parent from that output. And this makes it quite nice to work with. Now moving back to any and all let us test against a row or a list. So in this case, if we take present working directory like we did before, and we pass it in the path.split, we can then pipe it into any, which will let us test against each of the items. In this case, I want to test to see if any of the items are GitHub, which is true. And if I retype out present working directory pipe path split, you can see that GitHub is item number 3. We can do the same thing with all. So any returns true if any of them are true, while all returns true if all of them are true. In this case, all of the items aren't equal to GitHub, so it returns false. And you can kind of see how we can build up complicated chains of processing. The next new command is into_int. Into_int sort of does what it says on the tin as well. If we echo 4 as a string and we pipe it into int, it'll give us 4 the number back. This is a simple conversion from string to int. Now in my normal Z shell environment, I'm used to using JQ to process JSON values. For example, a common script I run is to grab the scripts section out of a package JSON. Using JQ, I can use this DSL query language to pull keys out of the package JSON and print them. It colorizes and pretty prints it a little bit, and this is something that I use fairly often for one-off scripts. Dumping this JSON object out is good enough for me, so let's see if we can use the experimental query function for JSON objects and get the same result. We'll need to open --raw package JSON for this to work. Notably, in the PR, the original author of this functionality isn't quite happy with the --raw being necessary. So if you're into contributing to open source projects, this could be a good REST project for you to get started with. So if we open the package JSON and pipe it to query JSON scripts, it'll give us a table, which isn't quite the output I wanted. The JSON output was good enough for me. But you'll see that because scripts is an object, we can see that each of the column names is the script name, and each of the column values in row 0 is the script itself. The output is a little awkward if we're trying to deal with JSON, but is internally consistent with everything I know about Nushell, and seems like it would fit really well into pipelines if I was doing more data manipulation. Now, by default, Nushell uses something called the auto viewer if you don't specify a view. It's the same as typing this command and piping everything to auto view. So to change that, we'll pipe everything to JSON. If we use the toJSON view, it dumps out and isn't very pretty. We'll also take this opportunity to tell it to output the JSON with an indentation of 2, which means we get this nicer output. Now we don't get the colors that we got before with JQ, but I think that's okay. Also quite interesting is if we don't quite like how long that script is, if we look at it, it's basically we have to open the package JSON, we have to pipe that to the query, and then we have to take it back to JSON and print it back out. We're not actually forced to use one approach or the other. If we've got JQ installed and we pipe it to from JSON, you can see that we get the same table output that we got before when we opened package JSON and queried it for scripts. So if I prefer to use JQ in the future, I can, and I can still integrate that with all of my Nushell pipelines. The Nushell JSON querying functionality comes from gjson. So if you're interested in how to query more complicated JSON structures, gjson.dev is where you need to go. In addition to the new commands, some new documentation for how to create Nushell commands of your own, and a list of quite lengthy improvements, we can get down to the breaking changes. Now, I've never used the help shell, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but that is no longer shipped with Nushell. There was also the removal of the YR and MON units, which were year and month respectively. And as far as I understand, the MON unit or the month unit was equivalent to 30 days. Which is confusing because, February doesn't have 30 days, and there are many other months which have more than 30 days. So this removal makes a lot of sense to me, because that's not typically how you deal with calendar dates. Also interesting is there's a new set of default features that got smaller. So they dropped a couple of the default features that ship with Nushell if you cargo install new or brew install Nushell by default. Now I have them all installed, so I can do things like generate a new UUID. We can go in and see that the UUID support is actually one of the things that got moved out into extras. And that's it for Nushell 0.30. If you're interested in Nushell, I highly suggest you go get started. You can go to nushell.sh and click Getting Started and install it for your operating system.